All right, everyone, so welcome to the intro video that I promised on philosophical writing, which I've called the Philosophical Writing Jamboree, and very loosely themed around fantasy-style writing. So this lecture will talk about how we should write in philosophy courses and how to evaluate arguments in the broadest sense of the term. So let's look at our agenda. So we're going to start with the arcane art of philosophical argument, and I'm going to give you some basic tools, and by no means all of them, to start writing your own philosophical essays. In this course, we're going to do writing piecemeal, so you won't be expected to write an essay immediately, but I want to give you an overall picture of what it's supposed to look like from the outset so that you know what parts you're trying to generate when you're generating them. And secondly, we're going to look at an exhibit of non sequiturs, which you want to avoid in your writing and in your argumentation. And then third, we're going to look at sentences of great woe. That is, sentences that students tend to write and that we should avoid. And then finally, we'll look at how to structure a paragraph and look at a boatload of examples at the end about how to structure a paragraph. There will be times in this video and actually throughout the course where I'll ask you to pause the video, and that's a good time for you to slow down, read what's on the screen, consider what the text is saying, and then before I give you an explanation of what to think about the text, try to come up with your own opinions. This is really the best way to learn. You want to always be comparing your own interpretation of the text with mine. Not that mine is always correct, but it's a little more trained than yours. So I think that's something that you might not get if you're just trying to read articles for class. So without further ado, one final note, my website has several PDFs and resources for people who are just starting out in philosophical writing. So if you don't really know what's expected in a philosophy paper, or if you want a sort of different take on how to do philosophical writing, then I really recommend looking at that stuff. And it's really pretty concise, so it won't take up too much of your time. So the arcane art of philosophical argument. So the short version is this. What is an argument? Sometimes people think that arguments are just the conclusion of an argument. That is wrong. Arguments actually have two different types of parts. They have premises and they have conclusions. So your argument, to state an argument, you need to have at least two items, at least one premise and a conclusion. Usually you have several premises and one conclusion, sometimes two or more. But all of that together makes up your argument. So an argument's not just an assertion. That's an important point. So let me get my little laser. All right, so the conclusion is the thesis. So you've heard probably your teachers in the past have told you to defend a thesis statement. So a thesis statement for our purposes is just equivalent to the ultimate conclusion of a paper. It's what the paper is most fundamentally trying to get you to think, what it's trying to persuade you of. So your task when you're writing philosophy in essay form and short essay form, really at all, is to find premises that jointly entail the conclusion, or else to analyze an argument in which the premises entail the conclusion, or to analyze an argument in which the author takes the premises to entail the conclusion, and then to find out what went wrong and why the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So there's really two properties of an argument that we can think about. One is what philosophers call validity. So a valid argument is one in which if you accept the premises, then you're forced to accept the conclusion. This is a really simplistic way of understanding validity, but it's good for 90% or more of the cases that we care about in philosophy. It's actually very complicated, the topic of validity, and if you're interested in this, you can go to Phil 10, which is logic. And in Phil 10, you would go through a lot of the things we're going to talk about today in way greater detail. That's not my job today. Today, we want to just get you up and running. So that's a valid argument. It's where, even if what you're saying is nonsense, if it's like, if walruses are fish, and if fish are sun gods, then walruses are sun gods. So, let me say that again. Suppose you say all walruses are fish, then you say all fish are sun gods, and then you conclude all walruses are sun gods. That is a valid argument. That's an argument that if you accept the premises, you would be forced to accept the conclusion. The problem with that argument is that it's a bogus, terrible argument that you should never accept. Why? Because the premises are totally wrong. A walrus is not a fish, and fish are not sun gods. So both premises are false. So we said that argument, though it's valid, is not sound. That is, even though it has like the right logical form, it has false premises. We'll get a lot of examples of this coming up in a second. Okay. Like one part where students often get hung up is like, well, once I know what the argument is, like how do I go about approaching the argument and engaging with it? Well, there's a lot of different things that you need to do in defending a premise of an argument. There's a lot of different modes and tactics and strategies for defending premises of an argument. I mean, one big case are what we call empirical premises. That is, premises that depend primarily on how the world is, and oftentimes how the world is in a way that we can only really know through science. So if you have empirical premises in your argument, you're not going to be able to just sort of sit down in your armchair and then divine what's right. You'll have to, at least, if you have empirical premises, open your eyes. And I mean, and hopefully for certain empirical premises in philosophy, you'll have to like read scientific journals. Okay? So those are empirical premises. They're not like conceptual truths. That's contrasted with what we might think of as conceptual premises or definitional premises. So definitional premises are just stipulations. It's like you just define that bachelors are unmarried men. That's sort of a definition. It's also a conceptual truth. So it's just like, if you're thinking about bachelors, then you're just thinking about unmarried men. That's really not, there's really no debate about that. As long as you understand what bachelors are, then there's like no, we don't have to like go out into the world and find out that bachelors are unmarried men. That's just part of the meaning of the word. So that's another way you can argue that something is a conceptual truth. One note about definition, don't just think that opening a dictionary is the way to find out what the definition is of a thing. If the definition of good could be ascertained by looking at the dictionary definition of good, then philosophers would have no jobs. Okay, if we knew what, say, matter meant and good meant and God meant, or at least if we knew the real definitions of all those concepts, then we would have very little to be doing in philosophy. That's to speak of nothing of other terms like what gender is or what the mind is, things that the dictionary just does not help you with. The dictionary gives you a good indication of what people, what the everyday person thinks about something, which is not always the truth about it. Okay, so another thing you might do with the premise is make a distinction. So some premises, and this is very common in philosophy, some premises make a distinction between two things that might not have initially been distinguished. So suppose your argument's talking about fish. So you might distinguish between fish that have teeth and fish that don't have teeth. And it might turn out that, say I think that fish are really tasty. You might say, well, Brian, you're right. Fish without teeth are tasty. But have you ever tried the ones with teeth? And I'd be like, no, I just eat the ones without teeth. And then you might argue, well, with this distinction, actually, it's only the ones without teeth that are tasty. The rest of them are terrible. So that's an important tactic in philosophy. And in fact, in medieval philosophy, there's this joke that once you run into a roadblock, make a distinction. So it's sort of a good impulse to make. A word of warning, though, if you make too many distinctions, it can get unwieldy. Moreover, some distinctions are nonsense, or some distinctions are very unhelpful, or some distinctions are invalid distinctions. And we'll see that in a second. Okay. And a final note about distinctions. Sometimes what you want to do when you make a distinction is make sure your distinction is complete. So if you distinguish between fish with teeth and fish without teeth, that's a pretty complete distinction. But suppose you made the following distinction. You made a distinction between fish that are red and fish that are blue. And you're like, fish are red or blue. That's an incomplete distinction because some fish are neither red nor blue. Some are green maybe, or I don't know, colorless, transparent. So if that's the case, then you've not made a full distinction, and the argument might suffer from it. Analogies are very common in philosophy as well for defending a premise. Analogies require you to show that how two things relate are similar to how two other things relate to one another. So you might compare how words relate to concepts to how, I don't know, how a pointer finger relates to a chalkboard. That's a very abstract analogy, but we'll see some more concrete analogies. And in the course on science fiction that we're embarking on, there's going to be so many arguments by analogy. And in fact, you're going to want to try to keep your eyes open and ears open for the analogies that are at work in the works of science fiction we're going to look at. And final note that sometimes premises don't need to be defended if everyone in the debate accepts them. So sometimes we'll all just agree that bachelor means unmarried male. If that's the case, then we don't really need to even always state the premise unless we want to be complete. And in those cases, those are not the premises you wanted to attack. Those are not the premises that really even need defense. Okay. So you want to always keep your eyes open for what premises will actually be controversial in an argument. All right. So a generic philosophy paper has these components. They're not always this well defined. Not every paper needs to have all of these things in the same degree, but this is like a basic blueprint. Like if you wanted to just bake a philosophy paper tonight, you could do it from this rubric. So almost, I would say just every philosophy paper has a thesis paragraph or embedded it within an introduction. So usually in a short essay, in the short essays you're going to write for this course, really it's one paragraph at the beginning of the essay that includes the thesis statement. So a thesis statement is a terse statement, 1 or 2 sentences will do. The shorter the better. Thesis paragraphs can often be, you want to usually contextualize your thesis a little bit. That doesn't mean to say everything that's ever been said about it. That just means for a person that is acquainted with the rough idea of the philosophical topic that you're engaging with, give us some context about what the general thesis is you're going to defend, and then give a very exact statement of what the thesis is. Again, the thesis is the conclusion of the paper. It's what you're going to give us premises to accept, or you're going to give us premises that will support the thesis. So after the thesis, you usually have to do a little background and stage setting. So it usually involves maybe reconstructing an argument or providing relevant information from other authors. This second thing is not always necessary, whereas argument reconstruction is almost always required if you're responding to an author, which is typical in the philosophy papers you're going to write. Then you need to provide your argument. Again, this might bleed over into the background. So your argument often might just be a particular critique of the argument that you reconstruct in the background. And you might point to a dubious assumption or a neglected alternative, or you might make a distinction, or you might say that the empirical evidence is wrong. You got to be careful about which one of these you choose. If you choose, say, to critique the empirical evidence, then you better be making a good empirical argument and not just be cherry-picking empirical evidence. Usually in philosophy, we try to make our arguments less, at least in the essays we'll do in this course, we want to be not thinking so much about the exact empirical details of what science today is saying, largely because we're talking about science fiction. So science fiction can often float free of the particular empirical facts that we have, and we're going to try to address instead conceptual issues and ethical issues and metaphysical issues that maybe depend on the empirical facts, but in a different way than we would usually think. So, okay. Then every good paper has an objection or a response to objections. You can do this by simply just plopping it at this sort of section after your argument, but you should be sensitive to obvious objections the author would make. So you're not going to want to defend a thesis that's uncontroversial. So if you're defending a thesis where you can't even think of objections to it, then that is a bad thesis statement. Theses should be somewhat, like there should be some rational person you can think of who would say that you're wrong. If that's not possible, then it's not a good thesis statement. So what you want to do, given that you have a good thesis statement, is you want to respond to objections to that thesis. So after you do that, then you're going to be at conclusions. The conclusion paragraph, which is short, and it restates what you did. Okay? All right. So let's get started with the first big tool you will use in philosophy. So this is my opinion. I think it's a good starting point. I think the idea of necessary and sufficient conditions is the first step you need when you're trying to evaluate a philosophical argument. Okay, this is Bart Simpson. Yeah, I will not confuse sufficient for necessary. So this is a common logical, a lot of logical mistakes can be reduced to people confusing necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay, so what am I talking about? If n is necessary for q, then that means something like, without n, there could be no q. So let that sink in. So if q is true, then n has to be true. Let me say that one more time. If q is happening, q is like some proposition. So think of some proposition. If that proposition is true, then n has to be true as well. In other words, if q is true, then n is true. This little arrow is just is a logical symbol. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but all it means is if q, then n. That's all the arrow means. If q, then n. It's the only symbol we're going to look at today, because that's all we need to understand necessary and sufficient conditions. So we then say that n is a necessary condition for q. Without n, you can't have q. All right, but contrast that with sufficiency. So S is sufficient for q means that q is all you need for S. Okay. Oh wait. No. This okay, so this is actually let me get a little writer out. This is wrong. This should be S. There, you're getting your extra money's worth today because I'm giving you more content than you originally had on this PowerPoint. There you go. So S is all you need for Q. Good thing I think when I talk, but not when I write. All right. So let me try that again. S is sufficient for Q means that S is all you need for Q. Okay. In other words, if S is true, then Q has to be true. So S suffices for Q to be true. That's another way to think of it. You get, or like the way I think of it internally is like you get Q for free if S is true. Like S just spits Q out. So if S, then Q. Notice that these are like the same logical form, but what's different? Here N is on the right side of the arrow, whereas here S is on the left-hand side. So like in other words, N is on the then statement of the if-then statement, whereas S is on the if state part of the if-then statement. So we said S is a sufficient condition for Q. S is all you need for Q. Okay, I hope I'm repeating myself, but it's important. So there are two sides of the same coin. Sufficiency conditions are always expressed by if. So if state sufficient condition, then whatever you are trying to state the sufficient conditions for follows. Now, necessary conditions are part of the then statement. So if whatever you're trying to provide necessary conditions for, then necessary condition. All right, this might sound like gobbledygook to you, which is fine. Review this, but here's an example, okay? So this is the easiest example you might think of. So let's just say that let's pretend that the following statement is true. If it rains, then the lawn is wet. Okay. Now don't give me a bunch of scientific cases in which the lawn magically fails to be wet when it rains. Let's just pretend that this statement is true. All right? We want to now think about which part of this is a sufficient condition and which part's a necessary condition. So it rains, or raining, is a sufficient condition for the lawn being wet. If it rains, then we get the wetness of the lawn for free, right? But here's another part of the coin. If it rains, it's necessary. It's a necessary condition for it raining that the lawn be wet. In other words, it can't rain without the lawn getting wet. So if the lawn isn't wet, then it didn't rain. Is another way to put it. So the sufficient condition is it rains. Rain is a sufficient condition for the lawn being wet. Intuitively, the rain is all you need for the ground to be wet. And in contrast, the necessary condition is the lawn is wet. So intuitively, it can't rain without the lawn getting wet. Okay, so if the lawn isn't wet, then according to this statement, the way it is written, then you can infer that it didn't rain. Right? Okay, that was a toy example. What about the hard examples? Like, what are some difficult examples? Well, these are the questions we would ask in philosophy, and these are questions for which it's hard to state necessary and sufficient conditions. So here's one example. We're not morally responsible for our actions unless we have free will. So this is a little different looking from what we just looked at, but I mean, it's really the same idea. The idea here is that free will is a necessary condition on moral responsibility. In other words, we're not morally responsible for our actions unless we have free will. What this statement does not say is that free will is sufficient for moral responsibility. Okay? In other words, free will is a necessary but not a sufficient condition on having moral responsibility, according to this statement. Okay, this is just some random thing a philosopher could say. Okay? Another example. Personal identity requires a persisting body. Okay, so personal identity has as its necessary condition a persisting body. What this is saying is that a persisting body is a necessary condition of personal identity. Again, this does not say that if you have a persisting body, then you have personal identity. Why is that? Because that would confuse necessary and sufficient conditions. Like, if you have a persisting body, you don't get personal identity for free. There might be other things you need. You might need also like psychological continuity. You might need overlapping memories. You might need like a sufficient amount of intelligence. A lot of stuff we're going to talk about in weeks 2 and 3. So the fact that something is necessary for personal identity does not mean that's all you need for it. Okay. Here's another thing. The existence of heteronormative families presupposes the existence of two genders. This is a little different. This is like the idea of like a metaphysical or conceptual dependence. It's like the existence of heteronormative families, requires the existence of two genders. In other words, without the existence of two genders, heteronormative families couldn't exist, according to this statement. All right, and finally, without the afterlife, life has no meaning. Another way to put this is that the meaning of life has as a necessary condition an afterlife. So in other words, a necessary condition on life having meaning is that there is an afterlife. All right. But that doesn't mean that if we have an afterlife, that life automatically has meaning, according to this statement. Okay, so I just noticed here that I didn't give you any sufficient conditions, but we'll talk about that in a second, okay? And throughout the quarter, we're going to practice this stuff anyway. So here's an exhibit of non sequiturs. Okay. Here's an example. Argument 1. Marriage is the union between a man and a woman. Therefore, same-sex marriage is wrong. So pause the video. What do you think about this argument? Unpause. Okay, so first of all, you should identify the conclusion and the premise, or the premises. Conclusion is usually marked off by things like therefore, consequently, as a consequence, for this reason, thus, and so on. These words are very nice to have that mark the conclusion. Okay, what's the premise? Well, it looks like this first sentence is offered as support for the last sentence. So marriage is a union between a man and a woman. Therefore, same-sex marriage is wrong. Okay. Now we want to evaluate the argument. So is this a good argument? No, this is a terrible argument. Actually, this isn't even a valid argument. This is an invalid argument. Why? Because even if we think the premise is true, so turn your lizard brain off for a second and just pretend like you have no associations or assumptions about how marriage is supposed to work. Just suppose you're trying to evaluate the logical form of this argument. Marriage is the union between a man and a woman. How could you conclude from a definition of what marriage is that some other form of marriage is wrong? Like the word wrong doesn't even appear in the premise. So this conclusion includes content that's not even present in the premises. And that's like a very big, it's a very big flag that you might want to keep in your hard drive whenever you're looking at an argument. If you see in a conclusion of an argument, in your own paper, for example, or even in the things we read, if you see words that are not in the premises in the conclusion, that's a clue that maybe the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. But what does follow from the premises? I mean, there actually is a conclusion you could make from this argument. If you think marriage is the union between a man and a woman, then you might just conclude that gay marriage is impossible by definition. So you might just argue that it's not wrong, it's actually just not a thing, right? Because the first premise is offered as a definition. Marriage is union between a man and a woman. I should say, I meant same-sex marriage. It's a little logically better. Therefore, same-sex marriage is impossible by definition. Because that's just not, like, assuming that man and woman are different sexes. Okay? And this just encapsulates what I just said, that if you have different words in the conclusion from what you had in the premises, then you should beware. But here's a slightly different argument. So argument 1 star, only marriage between a man and a woman is right. Therefore, same-sex marriage is wrong. Okay. So let's think about this for a second. Again, we have therefore, so we have a conclusion here. And then we have a premise, the first sentence. The first premise we can actually think of as stating a necessary condition on a right marriage, on a just marriage. So what is one of the necessary conditions on a just marriage, according to the first premise? Well, looks like you need to have a man and a woman. So it sounds like a necessary condition on a just or right marriage. I'm using just. The word just is different. So let's just stick with right. A condition on a right marriage is that it be between a man and a woman. That's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. There might be some marriages between men and women that are not right marriages. Why? Because this statement is not claiming that a marriage between a marriage between a man and a woman suffices for a marriage to be a just marriage or a right marriage. It's just saying it's a necessary condition. But this conclusion does follow from the premise. Only marriage between a man and a woman is right. Therefore, same-sex marriage is wrong. That is, a marriage between man or woman and woman is wrong. And that follows on two very plausible and almost like conceptual truths. One being that men and women are different sexes, and a second presumption, which is that right and wrong are negations of one another. Okay? If you thought this argument didn't work, you'd have to challenge one of those premises or one of those assumptions. Okay. But this is not a good argument. Okay? So for all the things I just said, this is actually not even an argument I would think people should take seriously at all, even though it's sort of logically valid. It's logically valid, but it's precisely not sound. Why is that? Well, because this argument begs the question. Okay? So that is, like, nobody's going to accept this conclusion who doesn't already accept the premise. Can you see that? Like, the premise just like almost restates the conclusion. But if you're giving me premises that just restate the conclusion, that doesn't give me independent support for the conclusion. So that's called in philosophy a begging the question. That means You're just presupposing what you're trying to show in your premises. You don't want to do that. People sometimes say begging the question and they mean like prompts a question. That's not what people in philosophy mean. In philosophy, we specifically, when we talk about begging the question, we mean that you're presupposing something without argument. Okay. Here's another argument. Some theories are unproven ideas. Evolution is a theory, therefore evolution is an unproven idea. Okay, pause, think. Unpause. Okay, so conclusion, again, nice marker here. Therefore, evolution is an unproven idea. And we have now two premises. One is some theories are unproven ideas, and another is evolution is a theory. Okay. Is this argument valid? You should, if you think carefully, you should think, no, this is actually, I mean, even if I accept the premises, this argument's a bad argument. It's a logically invalid argument. Why is that? Well, because right here, some theories are unproven ideas. And we're just saying evolution is a theory. But it doesn't follow from that evolution is an unproven idea, because the question that we need to address is whether evolution is one of these theories. And you can use what's called a Venn diagram, which you might have used in grade school, which I still use to this day when I'm thinking about arguments, at least mentally. And you might just think pretend like this green circle is just the circle of all theories. Everything in this green circle is a theory. And you got a lot of theories. You got theory of evolution, you got string theory, I don't know, you got germ theory of disease, and all these kinds of things. And then you have what this first premise is claiming is that some theories are unproven ideas. So here's one unproven idea. At least this is what some physicists claim to me sometimes. That they claim that certain versions of string theory are unproven. Okay? So if I'm behind on physics, don't kill me. I'm assuming that some versions of string theory are unproven. But they're still theories. But they're part of this little intersection of theories and unproven claims. But then there are some unproven claims that are just they don't even amount to theories. Like, here's an unproven claim. I'm a walrus. Or here's another unproven claim. Every time I'm not looking, there's an army of angels in my bedroom. That's another unproven claim. But it's not a theory, so it's not actually part of this circle at all. What this argument does is it doesn't give me any reason to think that evolution is in this part of the circle as opposed to this part of the circle. Like, if I'm going to retort, I might just be like, well, listen, why not just think that evolution is one of the proven theories? Or it's at least for all this has told me, it hasn't shown that all theories are unproven claims. It's just that some theories are unproven claims. All right, so I won't belabor that point. It's a pretty straightforward point. Argument 3, we're going to have to cut the education budget or go deeper into debt. We can't afford to go deeper into debt, so we'll have to cut the education budget. If you have ever listened to the proceedings of the American Congress, this should be very familiar sounding. Listen, I got two options. You got either have to cut Social Security, or cut benefits, or cut safety net. Cut the safety net, or go into debt. That's your options. Gun to the head. Those are your two options. And we're not going to go deeper into debt. Therefore, we're going to have to cut the education budget. So what do you think about this argument? Pause. Okay. Unpause. First point. So, marking the conclusion. So, I'm not pulling any tricks today. So, the conclusion is the last sentence of all of these. It's not always. In fact, often your topic sentences of paragraphs will be the conclusion, not the last sentence. In fact, I prefer it when the topic sentence is the conclusion, so that I know what you're arguing for. At any rate, we then have two premises. The first premise is that we're going to have to cut the education budget or go into debt. That's first premise. Second premise, we can't afford to go deeper into debt. All right, so is this a valid argument? So if we accept both premises, does the conclusion follow logically? Yeah, this is valid. It's saying basically, A or B. You got two options, A or B. one of them must be true. Well, B is not true. Going into debt is not true. We're not going into debt. Therefore, we're going to have to cut the budget. So if you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. Okay, this is called disjunctive syllogism, or it's got a lot of names. You can learn about them in logic in Phil 10. But now the question is, well, if this is valid, is it also sound? And I think that, I mean, any good faith reasoner who evaluates this argument will think that it's not sound. So why? Well, because this is a false dichotomy. Like, assuming that there are other items in the budget besides education that could be cut, this argument assumes that there are this argument assumes that there are no other items on the budget besides education that could be cut. So, in other words, I'm assuming that there are other items. So, like, in other words, why think that education needs to be cut? Like, why can't we cut defense spending or cut the pay that Congress gets, or why can't we cut Medicaid? Like, well, there's a lot of things we could do to decrease the amount that we spend overall, and that might be another option. So this is a false dichotomy. This is like when I was saying, when you are making dichotomies or distinctions, you want to make sure that you're being complete. This would have been a better argument if you fixed the argument. You could have fixed it by saying, we're going to have to either A, cut the education budget, B, cut Medicaid, C, cut defense spending, D, cut payment to people in Congress, or A, B, C, D, E, go deeper into debt. And then after you show that we're not going to go deeper into debt, we're not going to cut reimbursement to people in Congress, we're not going to cut Medicaid, we're not going to cut Social Security. After you show all of that, then you have shown that we have to cut the education budget. But notice that's a lot more. You have to do a lot more work for that. Okay, you're going to need a little more than like a campaign speech for that to work. And yeah, so this is the debt clock. Is people who run such debt clocks are into the idea that we shouldn't go deeper into debt. But then the question is, what should we cut? Okay. So this is a valid but bad argument because it's unsound. Argument 4 returns to our good old friends that we talked about before, about the rain and the ground, or the lawn. So argument 4 is, if it rains and the ground is wet, so it rained. Pause. Unpause. So the conclusion is, it rained. What are the premises? 1, if it rains and the ground is wet. And then 2, the ground is wet. Is this a good argument? Now, if you just paid attention to what we were talking about with necessary and sufficient conditions, you should say, no, this is not good. This confuses necessary and sufficient conditions. Like, all this is saying, this first sentence is saying, is that the ground being wet is a necessary condition on it raining. Like, it can't rain without the ground being wet. But what this argument did not say is that if the ground is wet, then it rained. It did not say that. That's another claim. You could have a third premise. You could say, if it rains and the ground is wet. Second premise, the ground is wet. Third premise, if the ground is wet, then it rains. That's a third and different premise. But here, all we're saying is that the ground is wet. And, the ground could be wet from a lot of things. It could be wet from sprinklers. It could be wet if you, accidentally spill milk on it. There's a lot of different ways the ground could be wet. So that's not what this argument is. This claim right here is not committed to the idea that the only way for the ground to get wet is by rain. Okay, so in that sense, it's more plausible. Okay. Right. And just a quick note. Some people think in philosophy, or thought in the past, that necessary and sufficient conditions were what we are looking for in philosophy. That's the gold standard. The truth, though, is that it's really hard to find them. So even words like sandwich, if you want to have fun with your friends, try to find necessary and sufficient conditions on sandwich hood, and you'll have you'll have trouble. Okay, argument 5. So there are a lot of examples we're going to go through. If you want to like have a smoke break halfway through this video, I recommend it. If you want to save part of it for tomorrow, that might also be recommended. I'm going to keep going because I am caffeinated. But if you need to, put this aside, let some of this stuff sink in, then do that, and then come back to the video later. But I'm going to keep going. So argument 5. I maintain long-term solar cycles are the cause of global warming. Show me I'm wrong. Pause. All right, so what's going on with this argument? Well, this is a little different from the previous arguments. So I maintain that long-term solar cycles are the cause of global warming. Show me I'm wrong. Is this a good argument? Your answer should be, it's really not even an argument. Why? Well, because remember like what we said at the very beginning of the lecture. An argument is not just an assertion. Here, he could have easily just said, or she could have easily just said, I assert that long-term solar cycles are the cause of global warming. Show me I'm wrong. And the implied sort of content of somebody saying this, like when people say this on like Fox News or the television, what they want you to do is they want you to actually accept what they're asserting. They are offering an assertion that, and they're offering and recommending an assertion for you to believe. Okay, so it's supposed to be, it's like a pseudo argument. They're trying to make it sound like an argument, and they're trying to suggest that, well, it's your job to show me that I'm wrong. That's not an argument. That's burden shifting. So if you just assert something, I can assert anything. I could be like, I am the Queen of France. Show me I'm wrong. That is not an argument. It is asserting something and then saying, well, you lack evidence against it, therefore it's true. It's generally poor mode of reasoning to say that, well, because we lack evidence for some claim, therefore that claim is false. That's one bad form. Another bad form is we lack evidence for this claim, therefore it's true. Both of those are bad. If you lack evidence for something, you should conclude that you lack evidence for that claim. And without further argument, you should neither accept nor assert nor negate that claim. You should neither believe nor disbelieve that claim. You should be agnostic about it. So this kind of argument is not very persuasive for that reason. Note that we often talk about the common ground, which is what both parties agree on in an argument. Here, they're not even trying. Like, ideally, a person who's trying to convince me that long-term solar cycles are the cause of global warming would start giving me some premises that I would accept along with him. Like, it'd be nice for him or her to give me some premises that they believe, but that I also believe. Like a premise that involved like basic statements of scientific fact that are common knowledge would be very good initial premises for a good argument because they're things that both parties accept. Okay. All right, so that was like a smattering of what you might find in philosophy and what are some of the big problems with some arguments you might come across. So the rest of the lecture is primarily about applying these ideas to your style and your writing in philosophy. Okay. So I have sentences of great woe, which are really actually just sentences that have good parts, but that have flawed parts too. But those flawed parts make them really hard for me to follow the argument. So you don't want to lose me. So some basic facts about life, or writing, or both. It can be found in Strunk and White. So Strunk and White and the Elements of Style is one of the oldest, not oldest, it is a very prominent manual for, not even a manual, it's more of a sort of how-to book on how to write reasonably good English prose. And I recommend it if you've never read such a book or never learned grammar. But one of the big things you should think about, especially in philosophy courses, is to use the active voice. And there's like a logical reason. Like for all these so-called grammar or style rules I'm about to show you, I don't really care at all that there are rules. Like, the fact that they are rules that your second grade teacher told you, I don't care about at all. What I care about is, I care about those rules that contribute to the logical understanding of your argument. So really, all I care about are those aspects of your style that improve the logical clarity of your arguments or deteriorate or destroy the logical clarity of the arguments. Okay? So here's one problem. Like, my first visit to Boston will always be remembered. If I read that in a paper, I'm like, okay, but who will remember it? Like, my children, my children's children, my parents. Like, am I the one who's remembering it? If so, why? So a better way would be to use the active voice. Another problematic one is my first visit to Boston will always be remembered by me. Then I'm like, well, if you're going to be the one doing the remembering, then why not just say, like, I shall always remember my first visit to Boston. That way you're the one doing the action. That's a much crisper and, notice, shorter way to express this idea. I like short prose because I don't like reading. I like to read as little as I can for the most effect. Okay, I like the most bang for my buck. So if you can write more concisely, that's always a good thing. Another thing that Strunk and White talk about is that you should put statements in positive form. So here's an example. The statement, the taming of the shrew is rather weak in spots. Shakespeare does not portray Catherine as a very admirable character, nor does Bianca remain long in memory as an important character in Shakespeare's works. After I read that, I'm sort of tired, and I wonder what I just read, and I'm like, what's in this academic mumbo jumbo? Like, weak in what spots? What spots are weak in the Taming of the Shrew? Like, is the entire thing weak? Are there just like 4 weak spots? Is it like the first sentence is weak? And then, Shakespeare does not portray Catherine as very admirable. Well, how does he portray Catherine? Is Catherine even in the book? Does he not portray Catherine as very admirable because Catherine's like not even in the Taming of the Shrew? I don't know. Nor does Bianca remain long in memory as an important character in Shakespeare's works. Like, in whose memory? In Shakespeare's memory? And in my memory? Like, in my children's memory? Like, I have no idea. A better way to write this and note, again, much shorter way to write this sentence would be to say, the women in the Taming of the Shrew are unattractive. Catherine is disagreeable. She's also in the Taming of the Shrew. And Bianca insignificant. So there are 2 positive things we can say about Catherine and Bianca. And a tip in general is to use these so-called auxiliaries, would, should, could, may, might, can, for situations involving real uncertainty. Or in philosophy, we also use them for mere possibility, or with should, we use them for, we'll talk about later, for statements of what you ought to do, ethically ought to do. Another tip from Strunk and White is to use definite, specific, concrete language. So, he showed satisfaction as he took possession of his well-earned reward. Like, he showed satisfaction? Like, what satisfaction? How do you show satisfaction? Like you can't just, like, make an expression. Your face is not, like, how did his face actually look? Did he, like, smirk? Did he frown? And he took possession of his well-earned reward. Do you just mean that he held it? What do you mean took possession? Did he, like, sign a contract to get it? Did he just, like, go up to the podium and get it, like, and take it into his hands? Like, what is actually involved here? You should also omit. Oh, here's a better option. He grinned as he pocketed the coin. Much better. Like, grinning is not telling me that he was satisfied. It's showing me, like, exactly why he was satisfied. He was satisfied because he grinned. Like, that's what showed me that he had satisfaction. And as he pocketed the coin, this tells me what the reward is. First of all, it's the coin. And then it tells me, like, what does it mean to take possession? Oh, you just meant he pocketed it. Like, he took the coin and he put it in his pocket. That's what you mean by took possession of. Okay, much more concrete, specific, definite language. You should omit needless words. So that means that you should as a sort of game, try to eliminate words and sentences that don't contribute to your argument. We'll look at that in a second. Moreover, you should express coordinate ideas in similar form. So here's an example. Tim is not only going to the opera, but also a member of the symphony. That might sound good initially, but think about what's going on. It's saying Tim is not only A, going to the opera, and B, a member of the symphony. Going to the opera and a member of the symphony are not the same sort of thing. Okay, so Tim is not only going to the opera, but he is also a member of the symphony. That's not even a very good way to correct it. But I want you to rewrite the sentence in a way where you're comparing the two things that you're coordinating, going to the opera and a member of the symphony, are like the same thing. Like two ing words would be a good option. So like Tim is not going to the opera, but Tim is not only going to the opera, but is drinking a scotch. He's going to the opera and he's drinking a scotch. This here does not have the two ing words. So you could also say Tim is not only an audience participant at the opera, or he's not only an audience member at the opera, but also a member of the symphony. That would be much better parallel structure or coordinate ideas. Okay, so some examples, some more examples. Okay. The first example. These are from real student essays from past semesters that I've anonymized. They involve arguments that you don't need to understand whether these are good pieces of philosophical prose. So this one says, Norcross makes the argument that humans cannot claim to have a higher moral standard than animals for two main reasons. While Norcross's arguments against the claim that animals have higher moral standards than animals are compelling. Okay, so pause. Try to think about what's wrong with this. All right, unpause. So Norcross makes the argument. So first of all, I'm like, whenever anyone makes the argument, I'm like, why don't you just say argues? Norcross argues that blah. Much shorter. We have an English word for makes the argument. It's the word argues. So just write that. It's shorter. Norcross argues that humans. I wrote that down. Yeah. Argues that humans cannot claim to have a higher moral standard. So then I'm like, okay, wait a minute. And hopefully you thought this too. You're like, wait. Like, what is a moral standard? What's a higher moral standard than animals? Like, what does that mean? Like, you might have thought, like, I've never taken philosophy before, and I don't know what a moral standard is. Well, neither do I. So, you need to be concrete. Philosophers try to make their languages accessible to a rational reader as possible, right? So here, it's not clear what the moral standard is. And here's some things I thought about when I read it. I was like, does the student have in mind, like, humans are morally grounded, or humans are morally important, or humans are morally relevant, or superior, or they have a moral compass, or like a conscience? All of those are consistent with this vague language. So you have to re-edit that. The second sentence has got something worse going on. And you might have noticed that it really doesn't even say anything. While Norcross's arguments against the claim that humans have higher moral standards than animals are compelling, I'm then like, then what? While that's true, comma, what? So this is a fragment. This actually doesn't say anything. When I come across a fragment in a student paper, I usually just ignore it. So if you don't want me to ignore the sentence that is a fragment, you should make sure your sentences are not fragments. The reason I ignore them is because they don't make any statement. If you don't make a statement, then you're not advancing your argument anymore, and therefore I can ignore it, because it's irrelevant. Okay? Example 2. Smith could say more about what moral patients are. Therefore, Smith's argument about moral patients is weak. So pause. Okay, if I had a quarter for every time I read statements of this form, I'd be like, I'd have at least $50. Okay, so this is an argument. You should be able to see now that this is an argument the student is trying to provide. It has a premise and it has a conclusion. And they even wrote therefore. They did a very nice job of trying to make an argument. The problem with this argument is it's terrible. It's not a good argument. Why? It says, Smith could say more about what moral patients are. Therefore, his argument about moral patience is weak. The problem with that is that, like, the fact that you can say more about something tells me nothing about whether or not what you're saying is true. So suppose I'm like, okay, like cows eat grass. And then you're like, listen, a lot more could be said about cows. Therefore, your view of cows is wrong. That's a terrible argument because, like, I might just know one thing about cows. I might just know that they eat grass. The fact that I can say more about cows has no bearing on the truth of that one claim about cows eating grass. So whenever you ask for more information, and sometimes it is important to ask for more information from an author, and sometimes it's actually important to call out philosophers and papers and say, listen, you neglected something. But the mere fact that more could be said, the fact that something, like the fact that morality is complicated, or that it's complex, or that it involves a lot of different concepts, is not an argument. It does not show that this conclusion, it doesn't show that Smith's argument is weak. It doesn't do that at all. The question is whether more information would be relevant. Your job is to show that more information is required. There needs to be some reason why I need more information in order to evaluate Smith's argument. Okay? Otherwise, you're committing a fallacy of relevance. Example 3. Thus, simply given rationality being the compelling factor of where to put the moral baseline, it seems that we must treat at least some farm animals well if we are to treat all humans well. So pause. Okay. So again, whenever you're evaluating something like this, you should always think, is it an argument? What are the premises? What are the conclusions? Well, the word thus signals that this is a statement of a conclusion the student was trying to draw. The conclusion is itself long, okay? It's an if-then statement. It's like, if rationality being the compelling factor of where to put the moral baseline, then it seems that blah. Okay. The problem with this phrasing is that it's actually pretty clumsy phrasing, and it's not very elegant, and it could be shorter and more logically compact. So here's one fix. Thus, if rationality is the moral baseline, much better. I mean, the author would have to explain to me what moral baseline means. Like, you might have been confused when you read that about what a moral baseline is. But, hopefully that'll be in the premises of whatever is supporting this conclusion. If not, then that's a problem. If rationality is the moral baseline, then blah. Then it seems that we must treat animals, at least some farm animals, well if we are to treat all humans well. I mean, I might have even gone further and said, like, why say that it seems that? Like, why not just say that if rationality is the moral baseline, according to my argument, if rationality is the moral baseline, then we must treat at least some animals, farm animals, well if we are to treat all humans well. Okay. I mean, there's a lot of ifs. There's a lot of ifs here. There's an if here, if here. So, like, this is actually a pretty complicated sentence, and in philosophy, it's often good if you're confused about, like, the structure of your own sentences. It is perfectly wonderful to break those sentences into many parts. You might say, if rationality is a moral baseline, then we must treat at least some farm animals well. And you might instead be like, well, I'm just going to take this part, if we're to treat all humans well, and just plop it into, like, a premise somewhere. But the point is just be as concise as possible. Example 4, I'm going to skip. Okay, example 5. It is important to note that the question of marginal cases points out that whenever you see words like if, then, those should be clues, because they state, like we noted before, they mark out necessary and sufficient conditions. That if full rationality is important to pointing out the differences between humans and animals, I guess then, what about the differences in rationality between some humans and the potential effect that has on their moral value? Okay, pause. Okay. So one of the problems with the sentence is it has a mixed plan. So Like it's like the student like fell asleep halfway through the sentence and like started off like being like, "Ooh, I'm going to state a necessary condition," and then then the student fell asleep and then they woke up and then they were like, "Oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pose a rhetorical question. What about the differences in rationality between humans and the?" It's like, don't do that. If you're going to pose a rhetorical question, then you might then do that if you think it's effective, but do that as its own standalone question. Okay. Like it's weird to state like, it is important to note that rhetorical question. Like that's bizarre. So don't have mixed plans. This sentence is very long, just qualitatively, so it's just likely to have a lot of problems. If you have a lot of problems like this, just write shorter sentences. Okay, and I edited this to what I thought was a sentence that preserved all the logical material from here without all the mumbo jumbo. And here's what it says. According to the argument from marginal cases, instead of saying it's important to note that, it's important to note that it's almost always a throwaway. It's like, if you're telling me it's important to note that, then why are you saying it? I mean, sometimes you can write it's important to note that, but if you write it all the time, then it's like the boy who cried wolf problem, okay? So according to the argument from marginal cases, rationality accounts for the difference between humans and animals. Way crisper statement. Like why talk about full rationality? Why talk about why do we have to talk about pointing out the differences? Like just say just talk about the differences. Okay? Example 6, some humans don't seem to display any faculty of rationality while some animals do. The more criteria used to formulate a distinction between humans and animals risks undermining marginal humans. Pause. So the problem with this, again, is this is a fragment. So this first sentence is fine. That's a full sentence. But then here it's like the more criteria used to formulate a distinction between humans and animals risks undermining marginal humans. This, I think, was meant to be the main verb, but it doesn't really go well with the subject. 7. The reason he left college was that his health became impaired. Okay, pause. So here, the reason he left college was that blah is better expressed just using a regular verb. Like, failing health compelled him to leave college, or else just say failing health caused him to leave college. Saying that the reason he did blah was that he blah is a more clumsy way of putting it. Another sentence that brings this out is, it was not long before she was very sorry that she had said what she said. Like, that's very clumsy. You could just say, she soon repented her words. Like, that she said what she said. Just say her words. Like, what she said what she said is just her words. Right? Okay. Example 8 is actually kind of now a famous example from an essay by George Orwell called Politics in the English Language, which is a great essay that has a lot of good examples of how not to write effective arguments. But here's an example. On the one side, we have the free personality. By definition, it is not neurotic, for it has neither conflict nor dream. Its desires, such as they are transparent, for they are just what institutional approval keeps in the forefront of consciousness. Another institutional pattern would alter their number and intensity. There is little in them that is natural, irreducible, or culturally dangerous. But on the other side, the social bond itself is nothing but the mutual reflection of these self-secure integrities. Recall the definition of love. Is not this very picture of a small academic? Where is the place in this hall of mirrors for either personality or fraternity? Okay. Whew. Well, I fell asleep reading this. One reason is that all of this language is completely mumbo jumbo. Like what is it? What is the free personality? Well, they're saying a free personality is not neurotic, and it has neither conflict nor dream. Like then what is it then? You're telling me what it's not, but what is a free personality? I'm just like really looking for some positive characterization of what it is. And he says its desires are transparent. Like what does that mean? Transparent to who? Transparent to the person having them? Like transparent, like what does transparent even really mean there? Like, for they are just what institutional approval keeps in the forefront of their consciousness. I guess this is actually an argument. Like, this little sentence here, like starting here to here, is like a micro argument. It's saying, for, whenever you see the word for, what follows is usually a premise or item that is meant to support what comes before it. So, for, like, premise, they are just what institutional approval keeps in the forefront of their consciousness. I guess the desires are just what institutional approval keeps in the forefront of their consciousness. Therefore, those desires are transparent. Like, okay, I guess it's assuming that, like, if something's at the forefront of your consciousness, it's transparent to you. That's the idea. Okay, semicolon, what? Okay. Another institutional pattern would alter their number and intensity. Like, what institutional pattern are you talking about? Is this referring tacitly to the institutional approval here? Like, what pattern? Like, what's the pattern you're talking about? Is it the free personality? Like, why are we talking about patterns now? Anyway, another institutional pattern would alter their number and intensity. I guess the number of desires and their intensity. There's little in them that is natural, irreducible, or culturally dangerous. What does them refer to? The desires? So there's little in the desires that is natural, irreducible, or culturally dangerous. This is just an assertion for which there's no evidence provided in the text. You should note that. Like, whatever all this mumbo jumbo means, like, this thing here, there is little in them that is natural, irreducible, or culturally dangerous. There is no reason for you to accept that. The fact that the desires are transparent to the person having them, that means, like, you know, if a desire is transparent to you, then you're, like, conscious of it, maybe. Like, that is no evidence at all to accept the claim that those desires are natural. That those desires are not natural, or that they are not irreducible, or that they are not culturally dangerous. There's just, like, no evidence for that at all. Okay. Another thing I want to know about this sentence, because it's extremely instructive about how not to write a sentence in philosophy. These semicolons don't give you any logical connection between what's going on. Like, you have no idea. If you write a paper with only semicolons, then you could very well give me no logical connectors between all these statements. Like, what would be nice here is, like, if more words like for were included. Like, if they said, like, if before another, they were like, consequently, another institutional pattern would alter their number and intensity. Like, that would be a total non sequitur. Like, that'd be a terrible argument. But at least it would be, like, giving me a clue about what this sentence is doing. Like, what the logical relationship between this sentence and all the other sentences is. If you just use semicolons, it obscures exactly what that is. Again, I'm not telling you never to use a semicolon. It's just that it's nice to use words like therefore, so, thus, for this reason, in contrast, words that signal to me, like, what's the relationship of this sentence to the other sentences? Okay. Well, okay, so now let's continue on. I never promised this video would be short. Okay, so on the one side, we have this. On the other side, what? The social bond itself is nothing but the mutual reflection of these self-secure integrities. Like, what is this saying? Like, is this contrasting free personality with self-secure integrities? Like, I didn't even know you could make the plural of the word integrity. I thought there was, like, only one integrity. But now they're talking about integrities? But, like, are integrities, like, social bonds, or what? And how is this a different side of the same coin? Like, why is this a contrast with this? Because, like, again, like, the idea is, like, logically, this is one side of a coin and this is the other side, but not sure why. And then it's telling us to recall the definition of love. Don't do that in your papers. If you ask me to recall a definition, it would be nice to briefly restate what the definition is. At any rate, is not this the very picture of a small academic? This is an ad hominem. This is attacking the character of the academic without drawing on, like, why the argument of the academic is bad. Where is there a place in this hall of mirrors for either personality or fraternity? Like, this is all what Orwell calls political language. It has really no clear, like, logical structure. Okay, but what I just did, the sort of micro analysis I just did on this paragraph, that is something you should try to develop throughout the quarter. Like, be really critical of what you read. And when I say be critical, I mean like be as critical as I was per sentence as be that critical. That doesn't mean all the text you need to be that critical for, but when you're analyzing an argument, it's important to look at each component that carefully. This lacks concrete language. All right, so now the hard lifting is mostly done. So I just wanted to end on how to structure a paragraph. So we already talked about the essay and now like how to structure the essay, but now how should you structure a paragraph? All right, so one thing is that you've not run out of topic sentences and you never will. So always have them. Like Supreme Court opinions, philosophy articles, biology articles, chemistry, like the Annals of Physical Chemistry, physics journals, all of these have topic sentences. Everybody has them. You're not too good for them. Then you should think of paragraphs as having a mixture of evidence and explanation that supports the topic sentence. Okay? If this is too vague for you, here's one way to use a cookie cutter approach, at least initially, to get yourself going. A paragraph contains a topic sentence, and then it contains what you might think of as two chunks that support the topic sentence. Each chunk, like what are the chunks? Well, each chunk has a concrete piece of evidence or textual support, plus two or so sentences that unpack and connect it to the argument of the paragraph. So you shouldn't just state evidence and then assume that I know magically and telepathically how it relates to the thesis statement, the topic sentence or the thesis statement. You should instead, in each chunk, have a sentence or two that explains why it supports the topic sentence. The most important thing is just do what you say you're going to do. Don't set out to do something that you didn't say you were going to do, and don't say you're going to do something and fail to do it. That's the whole point of having a topic sentence. It gives you yourself standards of success for what it would be for the paragraph to be a good paragraph. And what it would be for a paragraph to be a good paragraph is if you have a bunch of evidence and explanation in the paragraph that supports the topic sentence. Okay? If you don't have that, then the paragraph failed at its objective. Okay, I'm going to end doing one more sort of dissection of an argument. I'm going to leave the last slide off because I think this gives us enough examples so we can at least get started with. So here's a sample paragraph. Well, I should say this is a good time to take a smoke break. I'm going to probably spend 10 more minutes on this. So here's an excerpt from an article. This is from the beginning of the article, and it's an article entitled "Ethical Leadership." This is part of an essay that was generated by an online essay mill, from which students often purchase. Apparently, students purchase illegally essays that they then fraudulently turn into somewhere. And it turns out that the people who write these are not always very good. So this is one of them. Okay, so ethical leadership. Many believe ethics and morals are interchangeable. Indeed, there's a blurred line between the two. However, morality is a personal belief that individuals create and develop for themselves to govern their life. Ethics is a physical statement or a law that defines how businesses and people should act towards each other. There are many qualities that define an ethical leader: honesty, humanity, respect for others, fairness, encouragement of subordinates, and having no tolerance for ethical violations are characteristics of an ethical leader. Leaders can appear in a myriad of ways across many platforms that range from business to politics. Even celebrities can use their personal influence to state what an ethical leader should do by the way they act and how they treat other people. So take a second, think about what you just read, and try to figure out what the argument is and what's the logical structure. I'm out of water. Okay. So this means it's the end. All right, so the beginning is that states many believe ethics and morals are interchangeable. That is something that people might believe. The idea is that maybe people think that ethics and morals are just synonyms. Morality and ethics are just Like ethics is where you give an account of morals, and morality is just where you talk about ethics. Like this is the synonyms. And then the author says, indeed, there is a blurred line between the two. Like, what does that mean? Is this supposed to be like unpacking what this sentence is saying? Like, it doesn't really unpack it because it actually creates more problems. Because this author just claimed that these two terms are interchangeable. They are the same term. Like, they have the same meaning. They're in some sense could be substituted. But like, what exactly is the blurred line? Okay, so maybe the author is going to tell me what the blurred line is. They say, however, morality is a personal belief that individuals create and develop for themselves to govern their life. Okay, like, suppose you... This is one view of morality that we're going to evaluate in this quarter. But, okay, so the idea is like maybe morality is a personal belief that individuals create and develop for themselves to govern their life. So now I'm a little confused because they said there's a blurred line, but now I don't know what in other words, now I'm thinking like, is this what's going to be common between ethics and morals, or is this something that's different between ethics and morals? Okay, let's keep going. Ethics is a what's that mean? Physical statement or law that defines how business and people should act towards each other. Like, it's not clear. I kind of lost the thread because now I'm not sure. Like, you said there's a blurred line. That suggests that the two are the same in some respect, but you never said what the sameness between them was. Like, what is the common element between ethics and morals? You just gave me a point on which you're trying to claim that there's a difference. Apparently, personal beliefs are different from physical statements. But, like, this is not a very effective way to open this paragraph. Another thing is that I don't know in what sense it makes sense to say that ethics is a physical statement or a law. Like, some people think that there are moral or ethical laws, but what's a physical statement? Like physics makes physical statements. Like, it talks about bodies and billiard balls, but like ethics, like what? And then it defines how businesses and people should act toward each other. So is that the main difference? Is the main difference between ethics and morality that businesses and people should act is that ethics talks about how businesses behave, whereas morality only talks about how one person behaves? Or is the idea that like ethics involves how businesses relate to people, whereas morality involves how only one person works? But now I'm like wondering, like, wait, but like what about how people relate to other people, but not in businesses? Is that morality or ethics? So now I'm like confused. I'm like wondering, like, wait, I thought like morality is supposed to tell me how I relate to other people, but now you're telling me that it defines how businesses and people should act toward each other. Do you mean businesses and people, or both, or neither? Okay. And then they said there are many qualities that define an ethical leader. Okay, I just got like whiplash. Like, why are we talking about ethical leaders? Like, who cares? Like, we were just talking about the difference between morality and ethics, and now we're talking about ethical leaders. And they say honesty, humanity, respect for others, fairness, encouragement of subordinates, and having no tolerance for ethical violations are characteristics of an ethical leader. Like, why did you need to give me why did you need to start this essay by talking about the distinction between ethics and morality in order to get this idea on the table that, there are certain qualities that define an ethical leader? Like, in other words, like, suppose that ethics and morality were the same thing. Would it matter? Could I believe that ethics and morality are the same thing and still believe that there are many qualities that define an ethical leader? Why not? It sounds like all this stuff could just go away, or it could be the opposite. You could say that morality is identical to ethics. Therefore, nevertheless, there are many qualities that define an ethical leader. If you find that a statement could be true or false, and your conclusion could still be true, you should be wary that statement matters. Okay. Another thing, if this is an essay, I'm not sure what the thesis statement is. Are you going to be arguing that there are many qualities that define an ethical leader? And if so, are these the only ones? Are these the necessary and sufficient conditions for an ethical leader? Or are these just necessary conditions? I don't know. They're just a bunch of characteristics. And in an essay, are you going to argue that honesty, like there going to be a section on honesty, a section on humanity, a section on respect for others? That's a lot of stuff to argue. So not a very focused thesis statement. Okay, then the next paragraph starts. Leaders can appear in a myriad of ways across many platforms that range from business to politics. Even celebrities can use their personal influence to state what an ethical leader should do by the way they act and how they treat other people. Like, what is this? Why are you talking about leaders in general now? Like, sure, they can appear in myriad ways across many platforms from business to politics. But like, we're talking about ethical leaders. I don't care about leaders in general. I don't care about like Napoleon and Caesar. I don't care. I care about ethical leaders now. That's what your essay is about. And I mean, like, now we're talking about even celebrities can use their personal influence to state what an ethical leader should do. First of all, why are we talking about celebrities? So the fact that celebrities say that something is what the fact that celebrities say something does not give any reason to believe what they say. Okay, that is it's a fallacy. It is irrelevant that a celebrity said it. The fact that a celebrity said something is irrelevant about whether it's true, or it's irrelevant regarding its truth. So this is a very ineffective way to start the essay, and I would already at this point be skeptical that the student is on track to give a cogent argument. Okay, so that's the end of the writing jamboree. That's a lot of material. You might want to listen to this once or twice and develop the internal monologue that you need for reading philosophy and internal monologue that you need for editing your own writing. So I hope this helped, and I will see you all at Lecture 1 on Descartes, Plato, and Robert Heinlein.